Hello, hello.
Hello, we're back again wearing matching sweatshirts
Woohoo.
for episode 3 of our UTOK book series. Today we're going to actually start diving into the book, right? Into the first chapter. Last time we did an overview of the different sections in the book, did a little bit more of the context, the main themes in the book, and this time we're going to actually start talking about the specific chapters. So that's exciting.
Totally. Amen. Looking
In
forward.
the first chapter, I'm going to pull it up here so that people can get a feel for what this looks like. It's part of the first section of the book that's called The Context and the Problems We Face. So there's 3 chapters in that section, the 3 vectors of knowing, which is what we're going to dive into today, the meta crisis and the need for a new system of understanding, and the 4 great problems addressed by UTOK. So 3 vectors of knowing is the first one, following the preface. And that's a weird, it's a new concept, right? A vector of knowing. I've never seen that before. I think you told me that you're the first person really using that term. So can you explain what is meant by a vector of knowing?
Yeah, absolutely. This sort of comes naturally to me, and maybe I should have been clear about it in the book. But a vector is a mathematical concept, basically, formally. That's where sort of the term gets. It's about a position, a direction, and a magnitude. So you just an arrow that's got a point, it's got a direction, and a magnitude. Those are the things that define a vector, and then you can do all sorts of cool mathematical stuff with that. I'm bringing that concept and saying, actually, when we think about knowledge, it's got a point of view. So it's got a position and a direction that it's looking at. This whole issue of magnitude, we could get into some like cool analogies and things like that. But the easiest way to then frame the idea that there are vectors of knowing is to look out at different analyses of epistemology. That's that, hey, how do we know and how do we justify what's know? And pretty quickly when you do that in philosophy, you see that 3 big vectors appear over and over again. One is a subjective vector, the other is an intersubjective vector, and the third is an objective vector. Some of those folks that know UTOK will be very familiar with Ken Wilber. He got famous in part. I think his system really takes off in all the quadrants have the I vector, that's the subjective, the we vector, that's the intersubjective, and he's got sort of 2 vectors on the it vector, that's the objective. And I open a quote with another famous philosopher, Donaldson, who talks about who wrote a book, the subjective, intersubjective, and I can just read this real fast. Davidson says, sorry, I said Donaldson. It's Donald Davidson. Says, I want to first stress the apparent oddity of the fact that we have 3 different irreducible varieties of empirical knowledge, the subjective, the objective, and the intersubjective. We need an overall picture which not only accommodates all 3 modes of knowing, but makes their relations to one another clear. Without a generalizable picture, we should be deeply puzzled that the same world is known to us in these 3 different ways. So basically,
that really sums it up. Yeah, that really sums it up really nicely. And I like that he uses the term empirical knowledge. It's funny, how objective knowledge from modern science has dominated, truth seeking so much lately that when we hear empirical, at least coming from, training in academic psychology, that's my background, but, I'm sure other academic backgrounds may have this too. You think empirical, you think objective, scientific empirical, but that's not the only kind of empirical from a UTOK perspective, right?
Totally. Well, and in fact, certainly the word empirical roots back to empiricism, which really relates to observation. And this is a super important point that we need to be clear about, sort of like, what are the data that you see? And there's 2 ways in these different vectors, particularly the difference between the objective and subjective. Well, I'll start with the subjective. So what do we mean by this? The subjective vector is anchored to the subject observing the world. And what grounds that? We could call that, the ground of that is phenomenology. Okay, or in UTOK's language, mind 2. If it's your specific mind 2 and you're a human reflecting on it, then that's your I quad coin. So I open
opening your eyes in the morning, waking up, right, and just being presented with a world being you, right?
Totally.
Without any identification yet, just really thinking about the raw experience of being and
Right.
experiencing everything that's around you.
Right. So David Hume was an empiricist, and basically he's a famous philosopher that just emphasizes, hey, really analyzing the sensations and ideas that I get exposed to. I open my eyes, I see a coin, I see a screen. That's empiricism, and notice that's first person qualitative experience of being. The subjective empiricism is my own experience of being. Now, anyone from a scientific perspective will immediately say, well, who cares about what you see, right?
Right.
That doesn't matter. At one level, it's what we all collectively see, systematically see, okay, and can measure, and then build knowledge systems that justify why we're getting the measurements that we do, why do we get the results in experiments that we do, and this idea of translating the world into intersubjective agreement. There's a systematic empirical approach, and then translating that into mathematics. So we mathematically describe the entities, fields, and changes that we see, the behaviors. Well, that's the objective vector getting most obviously defined by science. And what I mean by science, I don't mean just systematic refined knowledge. I really mean the modern empirical natural science worldview that affords us clarity down into physics. David Duce, a physicist philosopher, calls these good explanations, at least in ideal. They're tight, they're mathematical, they reduce other explanations.
And I think really importantly, they're generalizable, right? So that's
totally.
They can be applied in lots of different contexts, and they'll always ideally yield the same results, right? They'll yield the expected predicted outcome. That's
totally.
Obviously not true for subjective knowledge that is different every time. In every instance of it, it will have its own particular characteristics, right?
Right, we can get into, that's a great distinction. Science tries to build general models of the terrain that it's trying to map. So chemistry is trying to map the structure of matter up into, from atoms into molecules. Physicists trying to, when you talk about the quantum, general field theories, etc., they're trying to map everything. That's why they talk about fundamentally real knowledge. Of course, you can get into more and more narrow views of science. I want to map genetics. That may not generalize to non-genetic things, but then that becomes the term. And we want to then say generalizable, repeated, and valid claims from any particular perspective in any idiosyncratic way. We want to extract what we can model and explain, and then everything else is error. The subjective vantage point of the talk actually is situated in the real, and it just encounters the empirical world, including what we would call scientific error. We can get into the distinction between that. But fundamentally, the vector first is phenomenology, lived experience of a subject in the world. Certainly, I would argue it arises with mammals, probably before then, and birds, and then everybody. But as we're primates and we open our eyes and we see the world as subjects, there's the objective, modern, natural, empirical. Those two things are definitely empirical, but they're different.
That's an interesting aspect of it. You pointed to it earlier when we were talking. There is this big historical evolutionary notion of these vectors too, right? Because like before science was ever a thing, modern science is held as this transcendental way of achieving truth, right? But it only came about much later. Subjective experience was the first epistemological vector, right, that ever arose.
Totally.
In animals. And then we get, culture. We're going to talk about the intersubjective vector, right? Third degree vector. And then because of that intersubjective cultural context, we get modern science, right? It is born out of this. So that's an interesting relation between them.
Right. So let's be very clear. And this is one of the things that's confused about science. But if we just take the historical evolution of knowledge, clearly there are mammal subjects that turn into primates that then start talking. UTOK says what they then generate are the intersubjective systems of justification. These are propositional networks, not phenomenology, nonverbal. These are verbal propositional networks that yoke people together and give them a sense of shared identity about what is and ought to be. That, by the way, is the ground or the structure of the intersubjective vector. And it's the capital C culture. So we have the subjective primate perspective on the world. Then intersubjectively, we get together and we build cultural collectives. When we believe in them, we're on the inside of that, and that's our intersubjective shared knowledge. Okay? And then we can decide whether you're on the inside or outside. If you know Wilber's quadrants, he's got the outside view, the inside view on the collective. But we could say this is we space. We have knowledge together. This is what we believe and value. This is what gives us our identity. That's the intersubjective cultural collective. And then as knowledge got increasingly sort of refined, we built math, and then people are trying to get, well, what's true independent of what we see as our own unique perspective? What's true independent about what we value? What's the most generalizable things that are true? The quest for that starts off with philosophy. In fact, Socrates can be argued to be like, kind of, we're just making stuff up to make ourselves feel good. Really, the Socratic method is sort of like, how do you justify? And then it sort of starts collapsing. Aristotle and Plato come up with models of ontology to try to stand up to. We can speak to refined epistemological questions. In our modern day, I would argue that, well, science grabs the Socratic question and then applies the language of mathematics and experimentation, and it grants us, that doing so grants us this new, more objective, but it's really intersubjectively generated objective knowledge. So that's super
it's enabled
important
intersubjectively.
It's
right?
enabled,
and it
right?
transcends that intersubjectivity to
Exactly.
reach objective claims.
Totally.
So by definition, then this vector of knowing, this way of knowing about the world that is totally objective and that factors out the subject, there's an inherent rift then there, right? By definition,
Totally.
between the subjective and the objective vectors of
Exactly.
knowing. How does that, we've seen that historically, at least through how UTOK maps the Enlightenment gap and the things that went wrong with this endeavor. I mean, lots of things went right, but also there was several rifts, right, between subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and objectivity. So where is the problematic aspect of that, and how does UTOK bridge that rift?
Beautiful. So there's a book back here. One second, I'll just grab it. It's a recent book by two physicists and a philosopher called The Blind Spot. Okay. And the blind spot basically says, hey, it's why science cannot ignore human experience. There's a subjective phenomenological and indeed intersubjective collective. How do we fit this back into the scientific equation? These guys are arguing, wow, once we factored out the subjective, we acted as though it didn't exist, and that created all sorts of different problems. UTOK argues that we can factor it. We need to recognize that science tried to factor it out, and we need to factor it back in to the equation in relation. And I just dropped one way of doing that, and that's this thing, the coin. Okay. And in fact, I got a little slide there where I talk about this is the seen spot. Okay. So now we can get into, well,
and to be clear, obviously that doesn't mean necessarily taking into account biases and things that are, very idiographic into scientific methodology per se, if it doesn't require that. Because by definition, modern science is defined against it, against the subject. And UTOK preserves that, but finds a way to relate it coherently so that we can make sense of the world in a way that's not fractured.
Totally. So the bottom line is, and then we can really get into this. This is a wonderful, rich question. In fact, it's a question for future generations. What I am saying is that the architecture, the vector of science, doesn't know how to frame and hold the subject. It doesn't. And what UTOK has is its three great pillars of knowing, okay, enable us to get clear about how to frame the puzzle that Davidson's pointing to. And that is like, there's a big puzzle about phenomenology, culture, and science, really, the objective science, intersubjective culture, subjective phenomenology. Those are the three, and empirically, you just open the world and you see the world through those lenses, but we don't know how to put them together. That's the issue. UTOK's three core philosophical, if we say, what's the most abstract level of UTOK? How does it enter? We talked about this last time. It frames science through the tree of knowledge. It frames subjective phenomenology through the I-quad coin, and it frames intersubjective culture, right? Through
the garden. Yeah, I have to bring the cover again because it just does that so beautifully, right? In the depiction, it has the three pillars here: the tree of knowledge, the I-quad coin, and the garden depiction, which essentially represent those different vectors.
Totally. Right? And that's why, and I really appreciate that, Christian, we ended up putting the picture right next to this statement. Like, Without such a general picture, we should be deeply puzzled that the same world is known to us in these three different ways. And I would argue the Enlightenment gap says that we're puzzled. And Davidson doesn't solve this as far as I'm concerned, but UTOK can now solve it. Speaking for myself, I have a total coherence between those three, and this picture provides the guide, an archetypal paradigmatic guide that is true to our best science. It's true to myself as a unique ideographic individual, and I think it's true to the wisdom of cultural collectives.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think we're summing that up nicely and concisely. We're still in 15 minutes here. So is there more things to add? I think an interesting question is what does that do for me, to know how to relate those different vectors of knowing? How does that change, my life in any particular way?
Totally.
I'm asking, and I think I'm going to start to answer, because the really neat thing that it does is it allows you to see yourself in the context of the cosmos, in the context of being a primate, of being a person in a specific culture, and knowing about science and being able to take advantage and have good scientific objective knowledge about the world that is naturalistic, and yet that still holds your specific ideographic place in the world in right relation to it. So I think that's a really neat thing that UTOK allows you to do.
Right. So I love that, and thank you for that. And let's just I'll just add my own I-quad angle on that, and try to then relate to other people and say, it's utility. This utility depends on what you're dealing with. If you're a philosopher of mind and science, I think there's a lot of refined utility that this thing starts answers very abstract questions. Okay. At a more everyday level, I was talking with my brother about this, and he's been following UTOK for a long time, but it never really, or it was the first time I really said, okay, let me just stop and just sort of like, how do you know about the world? And I was sort of thinking about this quote, right? And I was like, can you see that you know about the world through your eyes and ears, right? And look around. That's your first person empirical subjective experience of being. You see the road in front of us, you see the houses, right? And those are filled with, and you know about them through your qualities, and behind your eyes, you see the world in this particular way. That's your phenomenology. So subjective, phenomenological, and really it's Tom that's doing the knowing, is my brother. And so it's your psyche. So there's that. There's the subjective psyche. Now let's ask, we're going through this election, and we're inside the election, and you can then say we're all United, we're members of the United States. That would put you out in relationship, citizenship. What's your identity? Are you a Democratic or Republican? These are all cultural knowledge systems, right? They're cultural systems of justification that bind us together to what is and ought. Okay, go ahead. You're going to say.
Yeah, that's just the different layers of those cultural systems is something that we didn't get into. I think that's really informative and really cool. That's included on chapter 1, the Bronfenbrenner layers of macro, meso, and micro. I think those are cool ways to see, what kinds of justification systems are implicit in us just becoming an identity, right, and growing up in a matrix of different identities, of different cultural norms and societal expectations and all of that.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I've been playing around with this idea of vector recently. As you know, we've been talking about it some, and sort of like there's the direction, and then there's the size of it, and then even if you tie them together, you start to create almost like a sphere, right? And then if we take that sphere of knowledge, now take the Bronfenbrenner stuff works really well here. And UTOK, Bronfenbrenner's not quite as clear on this, or at least UTOK says, well, if we're doing macro level culture, we got to separate society. That's all the technological evolution intervention from capital C culture. Those are the nested systems of justification that define us on our intersubjective connections, and thus the identity, okay, of who we are, nested. First, if we start from the bottom, there's me relating to me, I, me kind of relations. And then quickly, I, thou. And this is what's called the micro relational level. Like the people you actually talk to, who are you engaged to, who's nested in your family, who do you go to school with or go to work with in a relation, okay? Where are you in the actual relational fields? Like social psychology would study this. But that's just the first layer. The second layer is all of those nested relationships are then nested in communities, larger scale. Companies, or you live in a particular side of the tracks, or you live in a particular area. You have a particular then extended, that's called the meso layer, middle. Okay, so micro, small, the distance there is significantly bigger when we move to meso. And all of these meso communities, which we then see one way of splitting them is there's the political government idea. Now we split those into two communities of Democrat, Republican. That's all nested inside of the United States as a national. So that's the macroscopic justification identity structure. And to the extent that you're inside of those are we statements. We believe, we the people, okay, believe, and then you see this tension between identities within that, and a lot of interesting things to say, but those are the intersubjective cultural belief values that clarify what is, try to cultivate what ought to be, to coordinate the legitimizing functions of groups. That's intersubjective knowing. And things like stories and myths really are great examples of knowing, and we can talk about what exactly you mean by knowledge, but the stories and myths that organize the paradigms, the ways of knowing for culture. And then there's finally the science, which we define specifically as modern empirical natural science. We use the men's knowledge architecture. So these are the three areas. And as I was telling my brother, he's like, well, Atomic is like, well, sure, science is totally different than cultural knowing like a Democrat, and that's totally different than me. So that's right. You have your subjective psyche, you have your intersubjective group identity, and then you have science. And those three vectors can be seen. And so if we're asking people like, just know that there's these knowing systems, and philosophy has to, like, we can really identify these. And this, of course, this overlaps a lot with Wilber's key insight, and we can give him a lot of credit for his quadrants in relation.
Definitely, yeah. And I think also an important thing is that those different vectors within a person's matrix of identifications, they can get into conflict. Sometimes there could be tensions between them, and to resolve those conflicts and tensions, you will want to know, what's coming from what, what's personal bias, what's personal history, or personal learning, whatever is cultural, whatever is scientific and more objective.
Totally,
so those are important distinctions.
Right. I think knowing them and knowing they're in a relation, we could do so much better across all of our education. I just happened to be watching on Theories of Everything with Kurt Jamungal. He was just talking with Leonard Susskind about string theory and things like that. And Kurt asked him, he said, hey, what are you passionate about? And what have you been? And Leonard said to him, I'm not a psychologist. And I'm not a psychologist, so I can't answer that question. and then, so ask me a physics question. And I was like,
that is funny.
Okay, fast. I mean, he's super developed in the physics side of the equation, and his entire justification is so emphasized there. And I'm sure we could ask him and we could break it down and be like, Leonard, what do you really care about and why?
Right, yeah.
I'm sure he could connect to that. But I was so struck that he felt like he had to bracket his knowledge and call it a knowledge of a psychologist to ask.
Yeah, it sounds like there's no ease to be fluid around those different aspects.
There was no ease to be fluid. And all I would say is, UTOK would say, well, that is your unique idiographic phenomenological experience of being we want a language to. You don't need to be a psychologist. Ideally, we would just be normal socialization that would allow us to have resonant attunement with what it is that drives our primate self, okay? Mm-hmm. And we would have a framework that allows him very clearly to say, okay, Leonard, even as a physicist, you are an I-quad coin contributing, then we're factoring you out. But all the things you're telling us about your history of string theory represent Leonard Suskind's unique idiographic justification. When we talk about science in general, we try to abstract this, but it's like abstracting the tapestry from all the threads. We have to know the relationship between the threads and the tapestry, often referring to the tapestry, but remember that's made up of threads. Susskind is a thread inside of physics that offers a particular justification. And we haven't had the right way to pictorially, conceptually thread subjective, intersubjective, and objective knowing and create and ultimately we're going to get to transjective. But those three threads need to be needled together, vectors from positions woven together. The tree of knowledge gives us the argument for the framework of natural into social science that can organize the tapestry of what we know, essentially going down to the Tina principle of most of the universe is made up of helium and hydrogen, right? And grow from
in the
there.
principle, just
I'm
to
sorry,
clarify, there is no alternative. Comes from Roy Bhaskar, right?
Exactly. There is no alternative. It's my acronyms good always to catch me, but I'm stealing that from, or borrowing that, or just using that from Roy Bhaskar, and that's he's able to say, hey, there's ontological claims that we can make if we apply this thing called the Tina principle, which there is no alternative.
Yeah, so we're reaching 25 minutes here, but I think that was a great summary of what this first chapter brings. I think it's an important chapter that sets the stage for what UTOK is trying to do, right? And like you said, there is very significant work by others who see this too, like the blind spot, like Ken Wilber. And in subsequent chapters, I think there's going to be more in-depth explorations of how UTOK fills those gaps in. Like, how does it describe subjective, the subjective vector, the objective vector with the TOK, the intersubjective with justification systems theory, with the garden, and there's a lot of exciting stuff that's coming up in the book.
I'll just say the last thing. I'll point back to the books over here. I'm building part of the tradition, which is what is generalizable knowledge about natural and social science, right? But there isn't a tradition for how to actually bring those to the unique look what I said about Leonard Susskind, or how does this relate to Democrats and Republicans, or all we don't have the knowledge systems that takes our academic generalizable into science knowledge. And my books, I didn't mention the coin in the garden as I laid out the academic argument for the problem of psychology and the Enlightenment gap. I couldn't even mention that. I had to get outside the academy to build these new technologies. So now we have to basically go, hey, but that's the point, is actually the overall novel zoomed out view of UTOK is that we now have ways to frame the puzzle that includes a way to coherently.
And that's funny, that's why it's published not in an academic context, right, without the peer review, because the coin doesn't pass peer review. It's completely outside of modern empirical natural science.
I mean, so whatever you would argue for it is your coin peer review. Right. Everyone would have a valid point peer review on the coin, because whatever
everyone is a peer reviewing its own.
Now we will connect that back to the key of the coin. The beauty of the coin is that it splits and gives you both the framework for the unique ideographic particular here in the real that says, I think the coin's a stupid piece of crap, and then affords us the connection to the generalizable.
Beautiful. All right. Okay. That's cool. That's exciting. Next time we're going to be talking about the meta crisis. That's the second chapter. I'm looking forward to that.
All right. Take care.